The Goldilocks Narrative Analysis. The Murder of Rhonda Sue Coleman, Hazelhurst, Jeff Davis County, Georgia, May 17, 1990. Revised edition, corrected analytical framework. This is just a subsequent version, guys. That's all that means. Just some intro stuff here. Part 1, the Goldilocks Narrative Framework. The Goldilocks narrative is an Occam's razor-based analytical methodology for identifying the most parsimonious explanation in a complex evidential environment. Its purpose is not to tell a satisfying story, but to identify the theory that fits all material evidence with the minimum number of required assumptions, and to discard everything that does not meet that standard, regardless of how compelling it feels. The Rhonda Sue Coleman case is presented here as a demonstration of the framework's most important function: correcting a belief that has been adopted not because the evidence supports it, but because the narrative feels good. This document explicitly models that correction process, naming each analytical step and showing why previously accepted evidence fails the Goldilocks narrative standard. So the core analytical principles being applied here will be evidence economy. You can pause and read these if you want. Feral emotional intensity standard, narrative contagion principle, polygraph discard. Okay. And maternal alibi standard, semantic disambiguation, rumor discard, and narrative attraction test. These are listed out specifically because they apply uniquely in this case. So for evidence economy, some of them do. Evidence economy, account for the most evidentiary facts using the fewest logical steps. Every unsupported assumption is a structural cost. Feral emotional intensity standard, where a suspect demonstrates documented, acute, unresolved emotional drive toward a victim immediately preceding the crime, that intensity constitutes a primary motive indicator. And this is specific to this case, guys. We'll see why in a minute. Where a suspect demonstrates documented, acute, unresolved emotional drive, obsession, toward a victim immediately preceding the crime, that intensity constitutes by itself a primary motive indicator. The intensity itself is the motive. No constructed narrative is required. Narrative contagion principle. In community cold cases, culturally resonant story archetypes spread through witness environments and organize subsequent memory and interpretation around them. Let's rotate this way. It'll be a little easier to read. There we go. Evidence that originates inside a saturated narrative environment must be weighed accordingly. Polygraph discard. Polygraph examinations perform at or near chance levels. Scientific consensus does not support their use as evidentiary tools. They are discarded in this analysis in both directions. A pass carries no exculpatory weight. A fail carries no inculpatory weight. Alibi standard. An alibi provided by a suspect's mother, claiming the suspect was asleep at home, is the weakest alibi class in existence. It is unverifiable, unwitnessed, and provided by an individual with the strongest possible motivation to protect the suspect. Semantic disambiguation. Witness statements using the word know or knew carry no evidentiary weight without threshold specification. Knew her and knew who she was describe categorically different relationships and cannot be used as contradictory evidence. Rumor discard. Unsourced community rumors, claims not attributable to a named witness with direct knowledge, are discarded entirely, regardless of how widely circulated or emotionally compelling they are. Narrative attraction test. When a theory is disproportionately popular in a community with a pre-existing cultural disposition toward its central premise, that popularity is itself a reason for heightened analytical skepticism, not a corroborating signal. So we'll see as we go through this what that's about, but we're going to expand on those things as we go through the evidence. So the victim here was Rhonda Sue Coleman, age 18, only child. She was a senior at the Jeff Davis High School. She disappeared on the night of May 17, 1990, and she also apparently died the same day. Last confirmed sighting, 10 p.m., convenience store, Hazelhurst, Georgia. Departing for home. In fact, that's a good question. We'll see in a minute, I think. But, did she die the next day or the 17th? Probably the 17th. Abduction scene, Bell Telephone Road, Hazelhurst, 3-mile route home. Vehicle, a 1989 Chevrolet Cavalier, found running, lights on, door open, purse inside. Body recovered May 20th, 1990. Remote wooded area, Montgomery County, 15 miles away. Condition, fully clothed, partially burned, post-mortem. Cause of death undetermined by, this is the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, undetermined by GBI autopsy. Body burned, compromised pathology. Georgia Bureau of Investigation inference, victim likely knew her abductor. Footprints show voluntary exit towards second vehicle. Yeah, we'll get to that too, but she obviously knew the person that had abducted her. It was pretty clear from the evidence. Very likely, say that. Status unsolved. Open Georgia Bureau of Investigation cold case. $35,000 reward active. Legislation, the Coleman-Baker Act, signed April 2023, allows family review of cold case files. The Coleman case is the one we're talking about here, but the Baker case is that was the case of Tara Baker in Athens, Georgia, who was murdered in her off-campus apartment. She was a student at UGA. She was a law student, and she was murdered. And that case dragged on for a very long time. I don't know, 20 years or something, before they finally were able to use, I think it was genetic genealogy, to figure out who the aggressor was, or who the, not the aggressor, but the murderer was. And they are in the process of a trial, or they've just finished the trial, I think, of this guy. So that case is closed, but that's where this is coming from. It was this Coleman and Baker cases that dragged out really long, and the families wanted to get the information that the police held, after whatever, 10, 20 years, because it wasn't going anywhere. And there were just a lot of issues the families had with the way things were done. So this act was meant to kind of rectify some of this. Another thing was just the, in the case of the Tara Baker situation, there was a death certificate that they needed for all sorts of practical reasons, and they couldn't get it. They couldn't get the cause of death, I believe, was the hang-up. So that act is about addressing a lot of the problems that came up through these two cases, and we'll hear about some of the problems with the Coleman case here in a minute. Timeline of the critical hours. 10 p.m., Rhonda says goodbye to friends at a convenience store in Hazelhurst. Departs alone in her Cavalier toward home. 3-mile route, 10:30 p.m., curfew. Apparently she was pretty good about these curfews. So this is one of those kids that, kind of was responsible. 10 to 10:10 p.m., Greg Newham, her ex-boyfriend, is seen by his own admission to a friend in town in the same period, in proximity to Rhonda's route. So let's read this again. 10 p.m., Rhonda says goodbye to friends at a convenience store in Hazelhurst. I'm trying to remember that convenience store. I think it was also a restaurant. But anyway, departs alone in her Cavalier toward home, 3-mile route, 10:30 p.m., curfew. But then right around the same time, 10 to 10, Greg Newham, her ex-boyfriend, is seen by his own admission to a friend in town in the same period, in proximity to Rhonda's route. So he's in the general vicinity. He could intercept her. Not that he did, but he could. Intercept her on her way home. 10:30 p.m., Layla Marshall, driving home on Bell Telephone Road, spots Rhonda's car on a side road. She knew her. Engine running, lights on, driver door open. Rhonda is gone. Layla turns off the engine, drives to call police. Yeah, I think maybe she didn't have a signal or something. I mean, this was quite a long time ago. I don't even know if she had a cell phone. But anyway, she drives to call police. 11 p.m., Rhonda's father, Milton, drives out looking for her, finds the car. 11:40 p.m. police arrive, approximately 90 minutes after the car was first found. So there's a 90-minute gap there between when the car was found and the police arriving, or shall we say, the opportunity to control the scene. Took 90 minutes. May 20th, 1990, a man surveying a remote logged tract in Montgomery County discovers Rhonda's body, approximately 15 miles from the abduction scene. It's a very strange case. You got a woman who's driving home, pretty routine, and all of a sudden she's pulled over onto the side road. So she's going down a main road on the way home. And then she turns off on this, I believe, a dirt road. Yeah, a dirt road. Almost like, someone had kind of flagged her down or something and wanted her to stop. And she's, we'll see in a minute, but she gets out of the car and walks up to the other car. And it's just very, very indicative of a situation where two people met that knew each other. Not strangers. Physical evidence summary. Footprints leading from Rhonda's driver's side door to the tire tracks of a second unidentified vehicle. The GBI's basis for concluding she exited voluntarily towards someone she recognized. I agree with that. Second vehicle tire tracks. Distinct from Layla's vehicle, an unidentified vehicle was present at the scene. Second vehicle tire tracks. Distinct from Layla's vehicle, an unidentified vehicle was present at the scene. And I think they did, I don't know if that's in here, but they did determine too, I believe, that they were tire tracks from what would typically be shod on a pickup truck, a full-size pickup truck. And that's important too. Of course, in that area of the country, everybody drove a pickup. But purse left on passenger seat, consistent with a brief voluntary exit, not a panicked flight. Probably thinking she was going to be going right back to her car, right? Body condition, fully clothed, burned post-mortem. Burning was deliberate evidence destruction, not incidental. Requires either accelerant or sustained fire. Body location 15 miles from abduction in a neighboring county. Deliberate transport to a remote disposal site. The fact that it's in a neighboring county has consequences for jurisdiction issues and that kind of thing. But you do have to ask yourself, did the person do this on purpose? To throw off, to make the investigation harder? I kind of doubt it. That has been thrown around, but I don't really see that as being very compelling. It's possible, but I don't think it's very likely. I think someone just picked a spot that they thought would be a good place to do it. Good place to dump the body. And it just happened to be in the next county over. I think that's more parsimonious. The narrative contagion problem. Why Hall became the primary suspect. Hall. Who is Hall? Let's go back to this here. Before analyzing suspects, this document addresses a methodological issue that corrupts the evidentiary picture in this case more than any other single factor. The adoption of a belief about the perpetrator that is driven by narrative satisfaction rather than evidence. You see, this is the belief thing coming into play here. We believe what we believe because it makes us feel better. The narrative that was chosen or that was popular was one that was more satisfying to the community. The community of Hazelhurst, Georgia, like most small southern towns of its era, carried generational tensions around law enforcement authority. Police were simultaneously trusted enforcers and potential abusers of power. The figure of the corrupt lawman protecting his own is not merely a theory in such communities. It is a cultural archetype with deep emotional resonance. It explains injustice. It explains impunity. It explains why cases go unsolved. It is a story template that communities already know how to tell. When Rhonda Sue Coleman was murdered in May 1990, and when the Jeff Davis County Sheriff's Department, whose sitting sheriff was Mark Hall Sr., managed the investigation in ways that many found inadequate, the archetype was available and waiting. The theory that Hall's son, Marky Hall Jr., was the killer, and that the sheriff protected him, filled that template perfectly. It had every element of the story: youth, authority, cover-up, community silencing, and impunity. Whenever you see this guy, we see this all the time in homicides and abductions all over the country. Usually this is a red flag. It's telling me that this is probably not the person. Now, I'm not going to say that. That's not enough by itself to say that, but I'm immediately suspicious because of this very strong current of bias against police and law enforcement. The narrative attraction test applied, a theory that maps perfectly onto a pre-existing cultural archetype. In a community with documented reasons to distrust the authority figure at the center of that theory, should be approached with heightened analytical skepticism. Its popularity is not evidence. It may be the opposite of evidence. It may be the signal that belief has outrun observation. This dynamic has a specific consequence for the evidentiary record. Once a dominant narrative establishes itself in a small, interconnected community, subsequent witness accounts, memories, and interpretations are produced inside that narrative environment. This does not mean witnesses are lying. It means that genuine recollection and narrative-influenced recollection become functionally indistinguishable from the outside, particularly after 3 decades of community saturation. Yeah, that's right. This does go back to, there were no cell phones at this time. I remember that now. Not they weren't in common usage, no. This is the Goldilocks narrative framework's narrative contagion principle in operation. It does not eliminate Hall as a person of interest. It requires that every piece of evidence pointing at Hall be evaluated for whether it constitutes independent observation or downstream narrative adoption, and discarded if it cannot be distinguished. Evidence evaluation. Marky Hall Jr. Applying the Goldilocks narrative analytical principles to each piece of evidence attributed to Hall produces the following assessments. The Mitchell Wood witness account. Mitchell Wood, a classmate of Rhonda's, stated to law enforcement that he saw Rhonda and Marky Hall together on the side of the road on the night of her disappearance, and that Hall threatened him to leave. This is the single most significant piece of evidence in the Hall candidacy. It is assessed as follows. Polygraph discard. Wood agreed to a polygraph and was assessed as truthful. Under the Goldilocks narrative polygraph discard principle, this result carries no evidentiary weight. The account stands as a witness statement only. And just to be clear, guys, law enforcement they're not stupid. They do know that these polygraphs are useless in terms of evaluating, the truthfulness of what someone's telling you. That's not why they use them. They use them because they're trying to intimidate and influence the witness. Because on the assumption that the witness, or the person you're talking to, the suspect doesn't understand that those polygraph tests are unscientific. If the person thinks they are, then they can use that to manipulate the suspect. That's why they use them. It's a game they're playing. They would love it if no one knew this. They would love it if scientists and researchers had never looked into this and studied polygraphs to find out, just how worthless they really are. But there you go. So, let's see. Here. We're not getting... Oh, just a second. Sorry, guys. I got a little distraction there. Oh. So, single uncorroborated witness. Wood's account has no independent corroboration. No second witness places Hall at the scene. In the absence of corroboration, a single eyewitness claim, particularly one produced inside a long saturated narrative environment, must be weighted as a claim, not a fact. Narrative environment contamination. Wood's account was given to the Fox Hunter podcast, not contemporaneously in 1990. By that point, the Hall narrative had been the dominant community theory for over 30 years. This is important, guys. Wood's account was given to the Fox Hunter podcast, not contemporaneously in 1990. Not contemporaneous. By that point, the Hall narrative had been the dominant community theory for over 30 years. The account's provenance inside the environment does not make it false, but it means independent and narrative influence recollection cannot be separated. This was a very long time after the event. Retained analytical weight. Despite the above caveats, Wood's account is retained as a witness statement, placing Hall at or near the abduction scene. It is the strongest single piece of evidence against Hall. It is simply not strong enough, standing alone and uncorroborated, to make Hall the Goldilocks candidate. And also, I would point out, it could be that after so much time has passed, that portions of that narrative are true. He may very well have seen Hall. He may very well have seen Hall talking to Rhonda Sue Coleman. But was he the abductor? So you have to kind of be skeptical here. Hall's denial of knowing Rhonda. This is interesting. Hall stated he did not know Rhonda Coleman. A friend of Rhonda's stated he knew who she was. This has been treated as a contradiction in most public analyses. Under the Goldilocks narrative semantic disambiguation principle, it is not. And see, one thing does not follow from the other, right? Hall stated he did not know Rhonda Coleman. Here's the quote. I did not know Rhonda Coleman, and he knew who she was, described categorically different thresholds of acquaintance. In a small town, a deputy sheriff in his 20s would be aware of most people in his jurisdiction, without knowing them personally. Both statements can be simultaneously true. This is discarded as evidentiary contradiction. It carries no analytical weight in either direction. So, Hall could have been saying he didn't know Rhonda Coleman personally, whereas this female witness who said he knew who she was, it's not the same thing. I did not know Rhonda and know who she is are two different things. The relationship and pregnancy claim. The theory that Hall had a secret romantic relationship with Rhonda, that she became pregnant, and that she threatened to expose him to his wife is the entire engine of the motive case against him. Under the Goldilocks narrative rumor discard principle, it is eliminated entirely. It's a rumor. This claim is explicitly characterized in the primary source record as rumors, not as testimony from a named witness with direct knowledge, not as documentary evidence, not as anything attributable to a specific person who claimed to know it firsthand. It is community rumor. In the Goldilocks narrative framework, community rumor in a decades-old case, saturated with a dominant narrative, has zero evidentiary weight. Without the relationship, there is no pregnancy. Without the pregnancy, there is no exposure threat. Without the exposure threat, there is no motive. The entire motive structure attributed to Hall collapses to nothing when the rumor discard principle is applied. The law enforcement suspicion narrative. A substantial portion of the community belief in Hall's guilt rests not on evidence of his personal involvement, but on suspicion of his father. That Sheriff Mark Hall Sr. mismanaged the investigation to protect his son. The investigative failures are real and documented. The inference of paternal protection is a narrative construction. The Goldilocks narrative framework acknowledges the documented failures. The scene was mismanaged. The Sheriff's Department took jurisdiction over a city limits scene. The district attorney was reportedly denied case files. These are real, but they are consistent with institutional incompetence, small-town jurisdictional politics, and general investigative failure, none of which require a guilty son to explain. Applying the narrative attraction test, the inference is disproportionately popular precisely because it completes the archetype. This is a reason for skepticism, not acceptance. To be clear, guys, this isn't the first time that the district attorneys have been denied case files. The reason why law enforcement does this sometimes, right or wrong, is because they are afraid that information is going to leak out. And they want to hold back information so that if they do get a suspect, they can use that to determine if that suspect is telling them the truth or not. So this is a very common problem, source of friction, whatever, because once you give it to the DA, it's out of the bag. You know, it could be shared, it could leak out. And, and it will probably leak out. So that's what that's about. Hall's Goldilocks narrative assessment. After applying Goldilocks narrative analytical principles, Hall has one uncorroborated witness statement, placing him at or near the scene. No established motive of any kind. No documented emotional connection to Rhonda. No relationship with her beyond passing community acquaintance. And a candidacy driven substantially by narrative contagion in a culturally primed environment. He is retained as a secondary person of interest in the strength of Wood's account alone. He is not the Goldilocks candidate. So see, all this stuff that tied him to this was all rumor and talk. None of it was actually based on real facts that we can verify. Kind of conspicuous. Evidence evaluation, Greg Newham. Greg Newham, Rhonda's ex-boyfriend, receives substantially less attention in most public analyses of this case than Marky Hall Jr. Under rigorous Goldilocks narrative analysis, the evidence profile is materially stronger. Each thread is assessed below. Feral emotional intensity, the primary motive indicator. The Goldilocks narrative feral emotional intensity standard holds that where a suspect demonstrates documented acute unresolved emotional drive toward a victim in the period immediately preceding the crime, that intensity constitutes a primary motive indicator. No constructed narrative motive, no pregnancy claim, no exposure threat, no financial argument is required. The intensity itself is the motive. Greg Newham's emotional state in the weeks before Rhonda's murder is not rumor. It is documented by the Colemans themselves and by people in Rhonda's circle. Rhonda ended the relationship approximately 1 month before her murder. Let's read that again. Rhonda ended the relationship approximately 1 month before her murder, specifically because Greg had become jealous and possessive. Specifically because Greg had become jealous and possessive. This is rich stuff, guys. 1 month is that period of time where you just have enough time to put together all of your crazy thoughts, and your emotional state is, most intense. It can take many months or even a year or more for someone to get over a relationship, especially if they're of this type of person that it looks like we're looking at here. Greg could not accept the breakup. He contacted Rhonda's father, Milton, directly, not Rhonda, to ask Milton to intervene and convince Rhonda to return to him. This is not the behavior of someone processing a breakup. It is the behavior of someone whose regulatory system has been overwhelmed by rejection. Let's read that again. This is not the behavior of someone processing a breakup. It is the behavior of someone whose regulatory system has been overwhelmed by rejection. We're talking about impulse control. So we have known emotions tied to some now what are impulse control issues. Most people have sufficient impulse control that they're not going to call the father and ask him to intervene. They know that's probably just going to make it worse. Or they should know that. But the point is that it's a bit impulsive. Very important to remember. Milton Coleman had to explicitly tell Greg to stay away from Rhonda. A father intervening to enforce separation between his daughter and an ex-boyfriend represents an acute escalation threshold. This is the clinical profile of rejection-driven obsession in a controlling personality. One of the most statistically reliable pathways to intimate partner violence in the criminological literature. In other words, guys, there's an elephant in the living room. And this Marky Hall guy had zero evidence of any of this going on. Actual evidence, not rumor. Under the feral emotional intensity standard, Greg had documented acute unresolved drive directed specifically at Rhonda in the weeks before her death. Weeks before her death. His emotional state was feral in the precise sense. The rational regulatory system had been overwhelmed by a drive state. The target was specific. The charge was acute. The trigger was proximity. He had all three on the night of May 17, 1990. Documented proximate presence. Greg's own admission to a friend places him in town, in proximity to Rhonda's route, in the same period she was abducted. This is not a rumor. It is a statement he made. A friend of Rhonda's specifically noted this admission, also noting that Greg had a gas can in the back of his truck at that time. Now, Again, in that part of the country, everyone drove a pickup, and probably half of those had a gas can in their truck. I don't know. I don't put a lot in that, but I do. At least it's consistent, though. This admission has two analytical consequences. First, it establishes that Greg was not where his mother claimed he was, asleep at home. He was in town. We already know this, right? This is the funny part. This is the other elephant in the living room. This admission had two analytical consequences. First, it establishes that Greg was not where his mother claimed he was. We already know she was either lying or didn't know what she was talking about, because we already know he was in town around the same time that Rhonda Sue Coleman was. So the alibi on its face is invalid. Second, it places him in the geographic and temporal window of the abduction. His own words put him there. The gas can. Greg was known to carry a gas can in his truck. Rhonda's body was found partially burned, a deliberate postmortem act of evidence destruction. The body burning required either accelerant or sustained fire in a remote wooded location. A gas can in the truck of the primary suspect at the time of the murder is not proof. But under the Goldilocks narrative evidence economy standard, it is directionally consistent in a way that Hall's profile is not. Nothing in Hall's profile at the time connects to the burning. Greg's gas can does. Post-murder behavioral evidence. Two behavioral facts about Greg's conduct after Rhonda's murder carry analytical weight under the Goldilocks narrative framework. Greg did not participate in the search for Rhonda. He did not help distribute flyers. He did not leave his house, despite having been her boyfriend of some duration, and despite being in town the night she disappeared. This is notable. People with intense emotional investment in a person, even former partners, typically join searches. Absence from the search by someone with Greg's documented obsessive attachment to Rhonda is anomalous. Greg spent the entire weekend at the Coleman family home after Rhonda's murder was announced. This behavior is interpretively ambiguous. It could reflect genuine grief, or it could reflect the well-documented phenomenon of perpetrators inserting themselves into the investigation environment to monitor what is known and by whom. In the context of his other behavioral signals, it adds to rather than subtracts from his profile. Now we come back to the maternal alibi again. Greg's alibi is provided by his mother, who stated he was asleep at home on the night of the murder. Under the general Goldilocks narrative maternal alibi standard, this is the weakest alibi class in existence. It has three structural failures. It is unverifiable. No independent witness can confirm Greg's presence at the home during the relevant window. It is unwitnessed in any continuous sense. Even a mother present in the same home cannot confirm her adult son's presence throughout an entire night without having monitored him continuously, which is not a normal behavior. It is provided by an individual with the strongest possible motivation to protect the suspect. Maternal protection instinct at this scale is itself a documented behavioral drive, or paternal for that matter, one that can override honesty in precisely this kind of crisis. Greg's own admission to being in town that night, which directly contradicts the premise of the alibi, further undermines its value. He was not asleep at home. He was in town, near Rhonda's route, with a gas can in his truck. The more we go into this, the more obvious this case becomes. Greg's Goldilocks narrative assessment. After applying the Goldilocks narrative analytical principles, Greg Newham has documented feral emotional intensity directed specifically at Rhonda in the weeks before her death. His own admission places him in town near her route on the night of the murder. His own admission invalidates his mother's alibi. He carried a gas can whose presence is directionally consistent with the body burning. His post-mortem behavior is anomalous for someone in his position, and his alibi provided by his mother contradicted his own admission. Has no evidentiary value. He is the Goldilocks candidate. The voluntary exit and what it tells us. The GBI's inference that Rhonda voluntarily exited her vehicle to approach the occupant of a second vehicle, based on the footprint pattern at the scene, is the most analytically significant physical evidence in this case. It tells us Rhonda recognized the person in that vehicle. She did not flee. She did not resist at the car.
She walked toward him. This inference is consistent with both primary suspects. Rhonda would have recognized her ex-boyfriend Greg. She would have also recognized the deputy sheriff. The voluntary exit does not discriminate between them on identity grounds. However, under the Goldilocks narrative framework, it does discriminate on probability grounds. The question is not merely who she might have recognized. It is who she would have had reason to approach voluntarily on that road at that hour. An obsessive ex-boyfriend who had been told by her father to stay away from her creates a more complex dynamic than a simple acquaintance. She might approach him out of habit, out of confrontation, out of an attempt to manage the situation. She might approach a deputy out of civic compliance. But only one of those people had a documented feral emotional state and reason that night to seek her out. Also, normally when police, wave you down, I would say it's more natural for the driver to wait for the police officer to walk up to the car. Even if it is someone it's just a subliminal thing. I don't see her getting out of the car to go talk to a cop. But it's possible. I just don't think it's as likely. Theory Matrix 7, Goldilocks scoring. So here we get into the scoring. You can look at this table, sort of pause and go back and forth. But basically, it's an 8 out of 10. That means that based on the information available to me, and by the application of Occam's razor, there's an 80% chance that Greg Newham is the killer. Notice I didn't say he was the killer. What I said was the odds favor him. Marky Hall is pretty low, 40%, relatively speaking. John, 30%. Unknown assailant, 20%. Let's see. If you want to look at some of this stuff, you can pause it. But yeah. Okay. The Goldilocks narrative on the night of May 17, 1990. Here's the narrative, guys. This is the narrative with the fewest number of assumptions, but at the same time with the greatest explanatory power. It's just right. It's just complicated enough, but not so complicated that it requires additional or extra assumptions. On the night of May 17, 1990, Rhonda Sue Coleman left her friends at a convenience store and drove alone toward home on Bell Telephone Road, a route she traveled routinely. Somewhere on that 3-mile stretch, she encountered a vehicle she recognized. She stopped. She got out. She walked toward it. The footprints tell us this. The person in that vehicle was Greg Newham, her ex-boyfriend of 1 month, a man whose jealousy and possessiveness had escalated to the point where her father had personally intervened to make him stay away from her, and who had been seen in town that night by his own later admission. His emotional state was feral, acute, directed, and unresolved. He had been rejected, publicly managed, and cut off. She was alone on a dark road. He had a gas can in his truck. What happened between the footprints and the body found 3 days later in Montgomery County is not recorded. But the body tells its own story. She was transported 15 miles to a remote wooded area in a neighboring county and burned, deliberately, methodically, to destroy evidence. This is not the act of a panicked stranger. This is not the act of someone who knew her, who knew the roads, who had time to think between the act and the disposal, and who had the means to start a fire. His mother said he was asleep. He was not. He said he saw her in town that night. He was there. He had the intensity, the proximity, the means, and the motive that requires no construction, because rejection, obsession, is not a theory. It is a documented emotional state with a documented behavioral trajectory that ends, in statistically significant numbers, in exactly this way. Why this narrative wins the Goldilocks test? It requires no rumors, no unsourced claims, no narrative archetypes. Every element is grounded in documented evidence or documented behavior. Okay. It is consistent with the GBI's own foundational inference. She knew her abductor. It explains the voluntary exit. She recognized Greg and approached his vehicle, possibly to confront him, possibly out of habit, possibly because she did not yet understand the danger. I think the latter. It explains the body burning, a gas can in the truck of a man who had time to think about consequences before disposing of a body. It explains the 15-mile transport to a neighboring county, someone familiar with local geography, buying distance, and jurisdiction. You don't need a cop to be able to figure that out. It explains the alibi. A mother protecting a son she may have suspected or known had done something catastrophic. It does not require a corrupt sheriff, a secret affair, an unconfirmed pregnancy, or 3 decades of coordinated community silence around a law enforcement family, or other such soap operas. It requires only what the evidence already shows. A man in a feral emotional state on the same road on the same night with the means and the motive and the absence of any alibi that withstands scrutiny. What the Hall theory requires versus what the Goldilocks narrative theory requires. One of the clearest demonstrations of the Goldilocks standard is a direct comparison of the assumption loads carried by competing theories. The Hall theory requires an intimate relationship between Hall and Rhonda, unsourced rumor, no named witness. A pregnancy, unsourced rumor, no medical record, no named witness, undetermined by autopsy. A threat to Rhonda to expose the relationship, unsourced rumor. Had to be on the road that night for reasons consistent with the encounter. One uncorroborated witness. Sheriff Hall Sr., Mark Hall Sr., to have actively protected his son through investigative mismanagement. Inferred, not established. Multiple department members to have maintained silence for 35 years. Required but not unestablished. Community belief to constitute independent corroboration. It does not. It is narrative contagion. The Goldilocks narrative theory requires Greg was emotionally obsessed with Rhonda. Check. Documented by the Colemans and Rhonda's friends. Check. Greg was in town that night near the route. Check. By his own admission. Check. Greg had a gas can noted by Rhonda's friend contemporaneously. Check. Greg's mother provided a false or mistaken alibi. His own admission contradicts it. Check. Rhonda recognized Greg and exited her car. Consistent with GBI inference. Check. The Hall theory requires 7 unsupported assumptions, 5 of which are unsourced rumors. The Goldilocks narrative theory requires 5 evidential steps, all of which are grounded in documented statements or physical evidence. Under Occam's razor, this is not a close comparison at all. Outstanding questions for investigators. Has Greg Newman ever been formally interviewed under caution by the GBI, as distinct from voluntary community interviews? Has he ever been asked to account for his presence in town on the night of May 17 in a formal investigative context? Is there any physical evidence from the abduction scene or body recovery site that has not been subjected to modern forensic analysis, including the Coleman Baker Act's new GBI cold case unit capabilities? Has the friend to whom Greg admitted being in town that night been formally interviewed by the GBI? And is that admission documented in the case file? Were tire tracks from the abduction scene ever analyzed against vehicle types? Greg's truck, if the same vehicle throughout, could potentially be matched. I thought that had happened, but it may not have, but certainly it should be if it hasn't. I'm pretty sure somewhere it was said to be a pickup truck tire. What specific accelerant evidence, if any, was recovered in the body disposal site? If an accelerant was identified, can it be matched to any source? For the Coleman Baker Act process, has the family requested access to the full case file under the Act? If so, does the file contain any documentation of Greg's formal interview status, alibi investigation, or forensic connection to the scene? The Act establishes a GBI cold case unit. Has the Coleman case been formally submitted to that unit for review under modern forensic technology protocols? I'm pretty sure it has. Because the Act is the Coleman Baker Act. So, conclusion. The murder of Rhonda Sue Coleman is, under rigorous Goldilocks narrative analysis, a case whose dominant community theory has been driven by narrative satisfaction rather than evidence. The theory pointing at Marky Hall Jr., built on unsourced rumors of a relationship and pregnancy, amplified by a culturally resonant law enforcement corruption archetype, and sustained by 3 decades of community belief in a small town, does not survive the application of the Goldilocks narrative analytical principles. When polygraphs are discarded, rumors are discarded, semantic ambiguities are resolved, and narrative contagion is accounted for, Hall's candidacy rests on a single uncorroborated witness statement and nothing else. Greg Newman's profile, by contrast, It is built on documented evidence that requires no construction, feral emotions, intensity toward the victim, self-admitted proximate presence on the night of her death, physical evidence consistency with the body burning, post-murder behavioral anomalies, and an alibi provided by his mother that is contradicted by his own words. This case is also, for that reason, the most instructive demonstration in this analytical portfolio of the narrative contagion principle. It shows precisely how communities adopt beliefs, not because the evidence is strongest, but because the story is most satisfying. The humble, unglamorous truth that Rhonda was most likely murdered by a jealous ex-boyfriend who couldn't accept being told no generates no archetype, no drama about institutional corruption, no decades-long community crusade. It's just an ugly, ordinary, statistically common act of rejection-driven violence against a young woman 2 weeks from graduation. The ordinariness is not a reason to dismiss it. Under the Goldilocks framework, it is a reason to take it seriously. The simplest explanation that fits all the evidence is the one we should be investigating, not the most dramatic one. Rhonda Sue Coleman kissed her mother goodbye and walked out the door on May 17, 1990. She deserves an investigation built on evidence, not on the story that feels most satisfying to tell. Some sources in here. And that's it, guys. See you on the next one.